My brother looked me dead in the eye, in front of Chicago's most powerful philanthropists, and said I was nothing more than dead weight taking up valuable space. What he didn't know was that I'd been quietly writing million-dollar checks to fund the very research they were celebrating that night. When they announced the largest donation in the foundation's history, every head in that ballroom turned to look at the woman my own family had written off as a failure. Before we jump back in, tell us where you're tuning in from, and if this story touches you, make sure you're subscribed, because tomorrow I've saved something extra special for you. My name is Sarah Chen, and until 3 months ago, I was invisible to my own family. Not literally invisible, of course, but the kind of invisible that happens when people decide your story for you and then stop looking long enough to see if it's true. For 8 years, I'd been living a double life so complete that even I sometimes forgot which version was real. The story everyone knew was simple. Sarah, the family disappointment, the one who dropped out of medical school after 2 years, who never found her footing, who drifted from job to job while her siblings built empires. Sarah, who lived in a tiny apartment in Lincoln Park, while her brother David commanded corner offices in the Loop. Sarah, who showed up to family gatherings empty-handed while everyone else brought stories of promotions and achievements and corner office views. What they didn't know was that the tiny apartment was paid for in full, along with the building it sat in and 3 others like it throughout the city. They didn't know that when I disappeared for weeks at a time, claiming to be figuring things out, I was actually in board meetings with pharmaceutical executives and research directors, making decisions that would reshape how children with cancer receive treatment across the Midwest. The irony wasn't lost on me that I'd become invisible, by choice. After leaving medical school, I'd watched how differently people treated me when they thought I was struggling versus when they thought I was successful. The struggling version got sympathy and advice and carefully worded suggestions about realistic expectations. The successful version would have gotten networking requests and dinner invitations and people wanting something from me. I preferred the sympathy. But tonight was different. Tonight, the Chicago Medical Research Foundation was hosting their annual gala at the Fairmont, and for the first time in 8 years, my 2 worlds were about to collide in the most spectacular way possible. I stood in front of my closet, staring at 2 very different versions of myself hanging side by side. On the left, the simple black dress I'd worn to every family event for the past 3 years, the one that said, "I'm trying but not too hard." On the right, the midnight blue silk gown I'd bought for last year's pharmaceutical conference in New York, the one that said, "I belong in rooms where million-dollar decisions get made." I chose the black dress. Tonight wasn't about proving anything to anyone. Tonight was about keeping my promise to someone who couldn't be there to see it fulfilled. The Fairmont's grand ballroom was the kind of space that made people stand up straighter just by walking into it. Crystal chandeliers hung from a ceiling painted with cherubs and gold leaf, and the walls were lined with floor-to-ceiling windows that looked out over Grant Park. 800 of Chicago's wealthiest citizens milled around cocktail tables, the sound of their conversations mixing with the soft jazz quartet positioned near the silent auction displays. I found my assigned table almost immediately. Table 52, tucked behind a decorative column near the kitchen doors. The kind of table where they put +1s and distant relatives and people who bought tickets but weren't expected to bid on anything significant. Perfect. I could observe without being observed, could watch the evening unfold without having to explain my presence to anyone who mattered. From my vantage point, I had a clear view of Table 7, where my brother David was holding court with the Foundation's board of directors. Even from across the room, I could see his confident gestures, the way he leaned in when he spoke, how the circle around him seemed to tighten with interest at whatever story he was telling. David had always possessed that particular brand of charisma that made people want to be associated with his success. He wore his achievements like a well-tailored suit, and tonight's custom tuxedo fit him perfectly. David worked in private equity, specializing in healthcare acquisitions. He was good at what he did, ruthlessly so, and he'd built a reputation for turning struggling medical companies into profitable ventures. Our parents loved to tell people about his latest deal, his newest acquisition, the company he'd just saved, from bankruptcy through what they called smart restructuring, and what I knew meant massive layoffs disguised as efficiency improvements. Watching him work the room, I remembered the last family dinner where he'd explained to our cousins why my extended gap year was actually a blessing in disguise. "Sometimes people need time to find their level," he'd said, cutting his steak with surgical precision. "Not everyone is built for high-pressure environments. Sarah's more of a creative type." Creative type. It was code for unemployable, and everyone at the table had understood it perfectly. What David didn't know was that his latest acquisition, Medicare Dynamics, had been struggling because they'd been systematically overcharging insurance companies for pediatric treatments while providing substandard care. What he also didn't know was that I'd been the one feeding information to the federal investigators who would be showing up at his newly acquired company's headquarters in approximately 6 weeks. But that was a problem for future David. Tonight's David was busy charming Dr. Patricia Williams, the foundation's research director, and explaining how his company's commitment to efficient healthcare delivery aligned perfectly with their mission to cure childhood cancer. I ordered a club soda with lime and settled in to watch the performance. The foundation's annual gala was always an elaborate theater production where Chicago's elite paid $300 a plate to feel good about, writing tax-deductible checks. The cause was undeniably worthy. Childhood cancer research desperately needed funding, but the execution always felt more about the donors than the patients. Which made sense, really. Most of the people in this room had never sat in a pediatrics oncology waiting room at 3 a.m, holding a child's hand while machines beeped and nurses spoke in whispers. They'd never had to explain to a 7-year-old why the medicine that was supposed to help them was making them feel so much worse. They'd never had to watch a family choose between experimental treatment and financial ruin. I had. Not as a doctor, not as a researcher, but as someone who'd learned that the gap between cutting-edge medical research and accessible patient care was wide enough to swallow entire families whole. That gap was where I'd built my second life, the one my family knew nothing about. 3 tables away from me, I spotted Dr. Robert Kim, the head of pediatric oncology at Northwestern Medicine. He was deep in conversation with several pharmaceutical executives, probably discussing the new treatment protocols that his department had been implementing over the past 2 years. Protocols that existed because of funding from something called the Grace Memorial Research Foundation, though Dr. Kim had never met the foundation's director in person. All their correspondence had been handled through lawyers and carefully worded emails, the way I preferred to conduct business when the business was personal. Grace Memorial wasn't named after anyone in particular. I'd chosen the name because Grace was what I'd needed most during the hardest period of my life, and Memorial seemed appropriate for something built to honor a promise I'd made to someone who couldn't see it fulfilled. The foundation existed in that careful space between transparency and privacy, legal but anonymous, traceable but not easily traced. Over the past 5 years, Grace Memorial had quietly become one of the largest private funders of pediatric cancer research in the Midwest. We'd provided grants for everything from early detection studies to experimental treatment trials, always with the same conditions. Results had to be published openly, treatments had to be accessible regardless of insurance status, and families had to be supported through the entire process, not just the medical aspects. The work was incredibly fulfilling and absolutely exhausting. Every research proposal I reviewed represented some child's future, some family's hope. Every grant I approved meant choosing between equally worthy projects, knowing that saying yes to one study might mean saying no to another that could save just as many lives. The weight of those decisions had taught me why most philanthropists kept their distance from the actual work their money funded. It was easier to write checks and attend galas than to understand the human cost of every choice. But distance had never been an option for me. This work was too personal, too connected to the promise I'd made, to be handled at arm's length. Preparing and narrating this story took us a lot of time, so if you are enjoying it, subscribe to our channel. It means a lot to us. Now back to the story. The Foundation's president, Margaret Sullivan, stepped up to the podium as dinner was being served. Margaret was exactly what you'd expect from someone who'd spent 20 years convincing wealthy people to fund medical research. Impeccably dressed, graciously confident, and skilled at making every donor feel like the most important person in the room, she was also genuinely committed to the cause, which made her one of the few people in this ballroom that I actually respected. Good evening, everyone, and welcome to our 20th annual Research for Hope Gala. Margaret's voice carried easily across the ballroom, warm and professional. Before we begin our program tonight, I want to share some truly extraordinary news about the future of pediatric cancer research in Chicago. I felt my stomach tighten. This wasn't supposed to happen. The announcement wasn't scheduled until next month, and it certainly wasn't supposed to happen while I was sitting 50 feet away from my brother. 2 weeks ago, we received the largest single donation in our foundation's history, $7.2 million to establish the Grace Memorial Center for Pediatric Cancer Research at Northwestern Medicine. The ballroom erupted in applause. I kept my hands in my lap and tried to look appropriately impressed while my heart pounded against my ribs. Around the room, I could see people leaning toward each other, asking if anyone knew who Grace Memorial was, speculating about which family had that kind of money to donate. At table 7, David was clapping enthusiastically, already calculating how he might leverage a connection to whoever had written that check. I watched him lean over to Dr. Williams and say something that made her nod seriously. The Grace Memorial. Foundation has been supporting our work for several years, Margaret continued. But tonight's announcement represents something unprecedented. This gift will fund a completely integrated approach to pediatric cancer care, combining cutting-edge research with comprehensive family support services. More applause. I noticed Dr. Kim nodding approvingly from his table, probably thinking about the research proposals he'd been hoping to fund for the past year. The Foundation's director has asked to remain anonymous, Margaret said, but they wanted me to share this message. This center is dedicated to ensuring that no family faces childhood cancer alone, and that every child has access to the most advanced treatment available, regardless of their family's ability to pay. I'd written those words 3 months ago, sitting in my tiny apartment at 2 a.m. after approving the final transfer of funds. They sounded different spoken aloud in this grand ballroom than they had when I'd typed them on my laptop. More formal and less personal. But the meaning was the same. This was about more than research, more than medical breakthroughs. This was about making sure that families like mine never had to choose between hope and financial stability. The applause gradually died down, and Margaret transitioned into the evening's program. I excused myself to the ladies' room, needing a moment to collect myself before the rest of the evening unfolded. In the marble-lined bathroom, I stared at my reflection in the mirror. The woman looking back at me was someone my family wouldn't recognize if they bothered to really look. Not because I'd changed physically, but because I'd learned to inhabit my own space differently. The uncertain medical student who'd dropped out 8 years ago had been replaced by someone who made million-dollar decisions with the same calm consideration most people brought to choosing dinner. But tonight, wearing this simple black dress at table 52, I was still just Sarah, the family disappointment who couldn't find her way, the invisible sister who took up space but didn't contribute anything meaningful, the woman who'd given up on her potential and was now drifting through life without purpose or direction. It was a comfortable disguise, and I'd worn it for so long that sometimes I forgot it wasn't real. Tomorrow, I'd go back to being the director of Grace Memorial, making decisions that affected thousands of families and millions of dollars in research funding. But tonight, I was content to be nobody special, watching my brother charm donors who had no idea they were sitting next to someone who'd just changed the future of pediatric cancer treatment in Chicago. When I returned to my table, the salad course was being served, and the conversation at nearby tables had turned to speculation about Grace Memorial's mysterious director. I listened to theories ranging from tech billionaires to pharmaceutical heiresses to foreign investors looking for tax advantages. No one suggested that it might be the unremarkable woman in the simple black dress sitting behind the decorative column, and that was exactly how I preferred it. The evening was just beginning, and I had no idea that within 3 hours, my carefully maintained anonymity would be shattered by the very person who'd worked hardest to make me feel invisible in the first place. The trouble started during the main course, when David decided to play the role of concerned older brother in front of his new pharmaceutical friends. I'd been quietly enjoying my salmon and the animated conversation at the table next to mine, about research methodology when I felt a familiar presence behind my chair. "Sarah?" David's voice carried that particular tone he used when he was about to perform some act of charity that would make him look good to observers. "What are you doing sitting all the way back here by yourself?" I looked up to find him standing behind my chair with Dr. Patricia Williams and 2 other people from Table 7. Dr. Williams was the Foundation's research director, a brilliant woman who'd spent 15 years building Northwestern's pediatric oncology program into one of the most respected in the country. Standing beside her was James Morrison, whose pharmaceutical company had been trying to partner with Grace Memorial for the past year, though he had no idea he'd been corresponding with the woman currently cutting her salmon into precise pieces. "Hello, David." I kept my voice neutral, pleasant. "I'm perfectly comfortable here, thank you." "Comfortable?" David's laugh had that edge to it that I remembered from childhood. The sound he made when he was about to say something cutting, disguised as concern. "You're practically eating in the kitchen. Come sit with us at Table 7. Patricia was just asking about my family." Dr. Williams smiled warmly, the kind of professional politeness she'd perfected during decades of dealing with donors and their relatives. "We'd love to have you join us, Sarah. David's told us so much about you." I could imagine exactly what David had told them. Probably some carefully edited version of my story that positioned him as the successful sibling graciously, supporting his struggling sister. The narrative would hit all the right notes: family loyalty, understanding, the burden of success including responsibility for those less fortunate. "That's very kind," I said, "but I'm actually quite content here." David's jaw tightened slightly, a tell I recognized from years of family dinners where my mere presence seemed to irritate him. "Sarah, don't be difficult. There's no reason for you to sit alone when you could be meeting people who might be able to help you." "Help me." The words hung in the air like smoke from a cigarette, visible and toxic. James Morrison shifted uncomfortably, clearly sensing the family tension, but unsure how to navigate it politely. "What kind of help do you think I need, David?" I asked the question quietly, without any challenge in my tone. But I watched his face carefully as I said it. "Well, networking, obviously. Career guidance. These are important people, Sarah. Patricia runs one of the most innovative research programs in the country. James here is VP of Development at Medicor Pharmaceuticals. You might learn something about how real medical innovation happens." The condescension was expertly delivered, wrapped in concern and presented as generosity. David had perfected this technique over years of corporate meetings where he needed to insult someone's intelligence while maintaining plausible deniability. The implication was clear. I was out of my depth, unprepared for conversations with serious professionals, and fortunate to have a brother willing to facilitate introductions despite my obvious inadequacies. Dr. Williams looked increasingly uncomfortable, probably wishing David would stop treating his sister like a charity case in front of potential research partners. James Morrison was studying his shoes with the intensity of someone desperately searching for an escape route from an awkward family conversation. "I appreciate the thought," I said, placing my napkin on the table and standing slowly. "But I think I'll stay here, Sarah." David's voice dropped to what he probably thought was a private volume, though it was easily audible to everyone within 10 feet. "You're being stubborn for no reason. This is exactly the kind of opportunity you need to get your life back on track. Get my life back on track. As if my life were a derailed train that needed his engineering expertise to return to proper rails. As if the track he had in mind was the only one worth traveling. My life is exactly where I want it to be, I replied, meeting his eyes directly. David's face flushed slightly, the way it always did when he felt his authority being questioned, in front of people whose respect he valued. Really? Living in that tiny apartment, working whatever odd jobs you can find, showing up to family events with nothing to contribute to the conversation? That's where you want to be? The words landed like physical blows, delivered with surgical precision, in front of 3 strangers who were now witnesses to my public humiliation. Dr. Williams actually winced. James Morrison looked like he wanted to disappear entirely. But David wasn't finished. I'm trying to help you here, Sarah. These people could offer you opportunities you'll never get sitting alone in the back of the room, feeling sorry for yourself. The cruelty was breathtaking in its casualness. David had just reduced 8 years of my life to self-pity and failure, suggested that my presence at family events was burdensome, and positioned himself as my savior, all while maintaining the tone of a concerned brother doing his best to help a struggling sibling. I felt the familiar heat rising in my chest. The anger I'd learned to swallow at dozens of family gatherings where David held court, while I was expected to be grateful for whatever scraps of attention came my way. For 8 years, I'd bitten my tongue, changed the subject, found excuses to leave early rather than subject myself to his casual demolition of my worth as a human being. But tonight was different. Tonight, I was sitting in a ballroom where I'd just anonymously donated more money than David would make in the next decade. Tonight, I was surrounded by people who knew my work, even if they didn't know my face. Tonight, I didn't need to swallow anything. You know what, David? I said, my voice still quiet but carrying clearly in the sudden silence that had fallen over our corner of the ballroom. You're absolutely right. David blinked, clearly not expecting agreement. Dr. Williams and James Morrison remained frozen, probably hoping this awkward family drama would resolve itself quickly so they could return to their dinner and professional conversations. I do live in a tiny apartment, I continued. I don't have a corner office or a corporate title or a fancy car in the valet line. I don't network at galas or play golf at country clubs or have my picture in the business section of the Tribune. David's expression was shifting from irritation to confusion, unsure where I was going with this, apparent capitulation. I don't contribute much to family conversations about stock portfolios and vacation homes and business acquisitions, I went on. I'm not impressive in the way you're impressive. I don't command rooms the way you command rooms. Sarah, I didn't mean, but here's what I do have, I interrupted gently. I have the deep satisfaction of knowing that the work I do every day makes children's lives better. I have relationships with families who trust me to help them navigate the most difficult experience they'll ever face. I have the knowledge that my choices matter to people whose names you'll never know and whose stories would break your heart if you took the time to hear them. The silence stretched longer now, and I could see other nearby tables beginning to notice our conversation. David's face was cycling through several emotions, none of them entirely pleasant. And I have something else, David. Something you might find particularly interesting, given your enthusiasm for this evening's cause. Dr. Williams was watching me intently now, something shifting in her expression that suggested she was beginning to reassess exactly who she was talking to. I have the perspective that comes from understanding that real impact happens quietly, without applause or recognition or photo opportunities. It happens in research labs at 2 a.m. and family meetings in hospital conference rooms and funding decisions that never get announced in ballrooms like this one. James Morrison was no longer studying his shoes. Both he and Dr. Williams were giving me their full attention, as if they'd suddenly realized they might be missing something important. So yes, David, you're right. I don't belong at table 7, with the important people making important conversation about important things. I belong exactly where I am, with a perfect view of this beautiful evening celebrating the kind of medical research that gives families hope when they need it most. I sat back down and picked up my water glass, taking a slow sip while the 4 of them stood around my table in various states of confusion and discomfort. David recovered first, though his recovery involved doubling down on his original position, rather than acknowledging anything I'd just said. That's very noble, Sarah, but nobility doesn't pay rent. These people aren't interested in your philosophical perspectives on medical research. They're professionals making real decisions that affect real patients. The dismissal was complete and devastating, designed to erase everything I'd just said and return the conversation to his preferred narrative about my irrelevance and his generosity in trying to help me despite my obvious limitations. Dr. Williams cleared her throat delicately. Actually, David, I found Sarah's comments quite insightful. It's rare to meet someone who understands the human side of medical research so clearly. David looked at Dr. Williams with surprise, as if she'd just announced her intention to quit her job and join the circus. Well, Sarah has always been thoughtful about emotional aspects of things. But surely you'd agree that the real work happens at the institutional level, with people who understand the complexities of funding and implementation. Certainly, Dr. Williams agreed diplomatically, though I've learned that the most effective research programs are those that never lose sight of the individual, patients and families they're designed to serve. James Morrison nodded slowly. Some of our most successful partnerships have been with organizations that prioritize patient outcomes over everything else. It's a perspective that's sometimes missing in pharmaceutical development. I watched David process this information, trying to reconcile his picture of these important professionals with their apparent interest in what he'd just dismissed as irrelevant emotional considerations. Of course, he said carefully. I just think Sarah might benefit from hearing about the practical challenges you face in your work. The budget constraints, the regulatory requirements, the complexity of bringing new treatments to market. Dr. Williams smiled. Those are certainly real challenges. Though I have to say, some of our recent successes have come from working with funding partners who understand both the practical and personal dimensions of pediatric cancer research. Something flickered across David's face, a moment of uncertainty. That suggested he was beginning to realize this conversation wasn't going according to his script. Funding partners? He asked. Private foundations, mostly, Dr. Williams explained. Organizations that can move more quickly than federal agencies and often have more flexibility in how they structure their support. Like the Grace Memorial Foundation, James Morrison added. They've been incredibly innovative in their approach to research funding. I kept my expression neutral while my heart rate accelerated. This was dangerous territory, the kind of conversation that could expose everything if I wasn't careful. Grace Memorial? David repeated, clearly filing the name away for future reference. I'm not familiar with them. They're relatively new, Dr. Williams said, but they've quickly become one of our most important partners. Their director has an unusual background that allows them to bridge the gap between rigorous research standards and real-world patient needs. What kind of background? David's question was casual, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. He was always looking for angles, ways to position himself advantageously in any situation. We've never actually met in person, Dr. Williams admitted. All our correspondence has been through intermediaries, but based on their questions and requirements, I'd guess they have both medical training and direct experience with pediatric cancer cases. David nodded thoughtfully, probably already composing the email he'd send tomorrow morning inquiring about potential connections to Grace Memorial's mysterious director. Well, he said, turning back to me with renewed patronizing energy. Perhaps Sarah should look into opportunities with organizations like that. It sounds like they might appreciate her. Emotional insights. The way he said emotional insights made it sound like a consolation prize, something valuable to people who couldn't handle real intellectual challenges. Dr. Williams frowned slightly. Actually, from what I understand, Grace Memorial's director has quite impressive analytical capabilities. Their funding decisions are based on extremely sophisticated evaluations of research potential and patient impact. I'm sure they are, David replied smoothly. I just think Sarah might find that kind of environment more suitable than some of the more demanding corporate settings. The insult was subtle but unmistakable. David was suggesting that I might be qualified for charity work with bleeding heart foundations, but not capable of handling serious professional responsibilities. James Morrison looked genuinely puzzled. Have you worked in medical research, Sarah? It was an innocent question, asked with genuine curiosity by someone who was trying to understand why David seemed so determined to diminish his sister's capabilities in front of people who were clearly interested in what I had to say. I've done some consulting work, I said carefully, helping families navigate treatment options mostly. That's excellent experience, Dr. Williams said warmly. Patient advocacy is incredibly important, and it's work that requires both analytical skills and emotional intelligence. David's smile was becoming increasingly strained. Sarah's always been good with people. I just think she could aim higher, career-wise. She has an unfinished medical degree, after all. There it was, the unfinished medical degree, delivered like a damning piece of evidence that proved my fundamental inability to complete anything meaningful. David had been using that particular weapon against me for 8 years, and he wielded it with practiced cruelty. Why did you leave medical school? Dr. Williams asked, her tone suggesting genuine interest rather than judgment. It was a reasonable question, and one I'd answered dozens of times over the years. Usually, I gave the abbreviated version. Family responsibilities, personal circumstances, needed to take time off that turned into permanent departure. But tonight, sitting in this ballroom where I'd just funded a multi-million-dollar research center, surrounded by people who respected work like mine, even if they didn't know I was doing it, I found myself wanting to tell the truth. My younger sister Emma was diagnosed with acute lymphoblastic leukemia during my second year, I said quietly. She was 11 years old. The treatments were brutal, and my parents were overwhelmed. Someone needed to become an expert in pediatric oncology very quickly, and medical school wasn't teaching me what I needed to know fast enough. The silence that followed was different from the earlier awkward pauses. This was the kind of silence that happens when people realize they've stumbled into something real and profound and heartbreaking. I'm so sorry, Dr. Williams said softly. How is Emma now? She didn't make it, I replied. But the 18 months between her diagnosis and her death taught me more about the gaps in pediatric cancer care than 4 years of medical school ever would have. David's face had gone very still. We'd never talked about Emma's death. Not really. At family gatherings, her name was mentioned only in passing, usually in the context of how tragic it was and how we'd all moved on as best we could. David had attended the funeral, had sent flowers, had said all the right things, but he'd never asked me about what it was like to watch our baby sister die slowly while our family fell apart around the edges. That must have been incredibly difficult, James Morrison said quietly. It was educational, I replied. I learned that families facing pediatric cancer need more than just medical treatment. They need someone who understands insurance systems and treatment protocols and clinical trial options. They need advocates who can speak both languages, medical and human. Dr. Williams was nodding slowly. That's exactly the kind of perspective that makes Grace Memorial's approach so effective. They understand that successful treatment requires addressing the whole family's needs, not just the patient's medical requirements. It sounds like meaningful work, James Morrison added. Have you stayed involved in patient advocacy? I glanced at David, whose expression suggested he was trying to figure out how this conversation had spiraled so far from his original plan to demonstrate my insignificance in front of his important friends. "I've found ways to stay connected. To the field," I said diplomatically. "Sarah does volunteer work," David interjected quickly, apparently deciding he needed to regain control of the narrative. "It's admirable, really, though it doesn't pay the bills, obviously." The casual cruelty was breathtaking. David had just listened to me explain why I'd left medical school to care for our dying sister, and his immediate response was to remind everyone that my subsequent choices didn't generate sufficient income to meet his standards of success. Dr. Williams looked genuinely shocked. "David, I think you may not fully appreciate the value of the work Sarah is describing. Patient advocacy requires extensive medical knowledge and tremendous emotional strength. It's not volunteer work, it's professional healthcare consulting." "Of course," David backpedaled quickly. "I didn't mean to diminish what Sarah does. I just worry that she's limiting herself by focusing on such a narrow field." "Narrow?" James Morrison repeated. "Pediatric oncology patient advocacy? That's one of the most complex areas in healthcare. The families dealing with childhood cancer need advocates who understand everything from cutting-edge research protocols to insurance regulations to psychological support systems." I watched David's face as he realized that his attempt to publicly diminish me was backfiring spectacularly. These people, his important pharmaceutical friends whose respect he valued, were treating my work as legitimate, meaningful, and professionally significant. "I'm sure it's very fulfilling," David said stiffly. "I just think Sarah could explore opportunities that better utilize her educational background." "Like what?" Dr. Williams asked pointedly. David paused, clearly not having expected to be challenged to provide specific alternatives to work he'd just heard described as professionally significant by people whose opinions he valued. "Corporate positions," he said finally. "Healthcare administration. Something with more advancement potential." "More advancement potential than directly improving outcomes for children with cancer?" Dr. Williams's tone was cooling noticeably. James Morrison was studying David with the kind of expression reserved for people who'd just revealed something unpleasant about their character. "I have to say, David, from what Sarah's describing, it sounds like she's found exactly the right application for her medical training and personal experience." The tables had turned completely. David's important friends were not only failing to see me as the family disappointment he'd presented them with, they were actively challenging his dismissal of my work and questioning his understanding of its value. "Well," David said, his voice tight with barely controlled irritation, "I suppose we all have different definitions of success." It was a retreat disguised as a philosophical observation, but everyone at the table understood it as David's admission that the conversation hadn't gone according to his plan. "Yes," I said quietly, looking directly at my brother. "I suppose we do." The conversation might have ended there, with David's awkward retreat and my quiet victory. But James Morrison had the kind of mind that didn't let interesting details slip away unexamined. As Dr. Williams and David exchanged strained pleasantries about the evening's program, James remained focused on me with the intensity of someone solving a puzzle. "Sarah," he said, ignoring David's obvious desire to end this particular discussion, "when you mentioned helping families navigate treatment protocols, are you familiar with the research being done on genetic markers for early detection?" It was a specific question, the kind that separated people who talked generally about pediatric cancer from those who understood the actual science being conducted in laboratories across the country. James was testing me, though I suspected he didn't realize how dangerous that test might be for my carefully maintained anonymity. "Some," I replied carefully. "The Northwestern studies have been particularly promising." "Exactly." James's face lit up with professional enthusiasm. "We've been trying to partner with the research team there, but their funding structure is unusual. Most of their grants come from a single private foundation that has very specific requirements about how research gets conducted and published. Dr. Williams nodded. Grace Memorial has been incredibly supportive, but they also have the most rigorous standards I've ever encountered. Their funding requirements include provisions for open-source publication, insurance-neutral treatment access, and comprehensive family support services. It's exactly what pediatric cancer research should look like, but it's also expensive and complex to implement. I kept my expression neutral while internally cringing. Every detail they mentioned was something I'd personally written into Grace Memorial's funding agreements, requirements born from watching Emma's treatment and seeing how many families fell through the cracks of a system that prioritized profit over patience. That sounds like the kind of foundation Sarah should work with, David said, apparently deciding that redirecting the conversation toward my potential employment was safer than continuing to have his dismissive attitude challenged by his professional contacts. Actually, James said thoughtfully, we've been trying to connect with Grace Memorial's leadership for months. They're incredibly responsive to research proposals, but they're also remarkably secretive about their internal operations. Our usual channels for building foundation relationships haven't worked at all. What do you mean? Dr. Williams asked. Well, typically, when we want to partner with a major foundation, we start by identifying their board members, their social connections, their involvement with other charitable organizations. Then we arrange introductions through mutual contacts, invite them to events like this one, build relationships that can support long-term collaboration. David was nodding along, recognizing this as the kind of strategic networking that formed the backbone of his own professional success. But Grace Memorial doesn't seem to exist in those networks, James continued. No board members at charity galas, no leadership profiles in foundation directories, no social media presence, no corporate partnerships that we can trace. They operate like a ghost organization that only materializes when they're evaluating research proposals. How do you communicate with them? David asked, his curiosity clearly piqued by the challenge of an entity that couldn't be networked with through traditional means. Everything goes through a law firm, Dr. Williams explained. Rothschild, Martinez and Associates. They handle all correspondence, contract negotiations, and fund transfers. We've never had direct contact with anyone from the foundation itself. I had to admire James Rothschild's discretion. I'd been working with his firm for 5 years, and they'd never once hinted to anyone that Grace Memorial's mysterious director was a woman in her early 30s who conducted most of her business from a coffee shop in Lincoln Park. That's unusual, David mused. Most foundation leaders want recognition for their philanthropy. Tax benefits, social status, networking opportunities. Why would someone donate millions of dollars anonymously? Maybe they understand that the work is more important than the recognition, I suggested quietly. David shot me a look that suggested he found this perspective naive. Sarah, nobody gives away millions of dollars without wanting something in return. Recognition, tax advantages, social connections, business opportunities. Charity is networking with better publicity. The cynicism was casual and complete, delivered with the confidence of someone who'd never experienced generosity that wasn't strategic. It was also a perfect distillation of everything I'd learned to hate about the world David inhabited, where every human interaction was evaluated for its potential to advance personal interests. Dr. Williams looked uncomfortable. I think that's rather harsh, David. Some people genuinely want to make a difference. Of course they do, David agreed smoothly. But they also want credit for making that difference. Anonymous donation is just good marketing. It creates mystique, while avoiding the obligation to give publicly to other causes. James Morrison was studying me again, his expression thoughtful. What do you think, Sarah? In your patient advocacy work, have you encountered donors who seemed genuinely motivated by altruism rather than recognition? It was another test, though I wasn't sure whether James was testing my knowledge, my values, or something else entirely. His questions had been getting progressively more specific, and I was beginning to wonder if his interest in my background was purely conversational. I've met families who give generously to research because they understand what it means to need that research desperately, I said. For them, it's not about recognition or tax benefits. It's about making sure other families don't go through what they went through. Families who've lost children? Dr. Williams asked gently. Or families who've watched children suffer through treatments that were the best available, but still brutal and uncertain. Those families understand that every advance in research, every improvement in care protocols, every dollar spent on support services represents some other child's chance at survival. The silence that followed was heavy with recognition. Everyone at this table worked in healthcare or pharmaceutical development, which meant everyone had seen the human cost of inadequate research funding and incomplete treatment options. That's exactly the perspective that comes through in Grace Memorial's funding requirements, Dr. Williams said slowly. Their grants always include provisions that show deep understanding of what families actually need during treatment. Like, what? David asked, apparently sensing that this conversation was moving toward something significant, but unsure what that might be. Comprehensive support, James answered. Not just funding for research, but money for family counseling, educational support for siblings, financial assistance for parents who need to take time off work, transportation and housing assistance for families traveling for treatment. It's incredibly thoughtful, Dr. Williams added. Most research grants focus exclusively on the scientific work. Grace Memorial funds the whole ecosystem that surrounds successful treatment. I felt a familiar warmth in my chest, the satisfaction that came from knowing that my funding was reaching families in exactly the ways I'd intended. When I wrote those grant requirements, I was thinking about my parents driving 2 hours each way to the hospital, about David and me missing school and falling behind in our classes, about the impossible choices families face between medical, bills, and mortgage payments. That sounds expensive, David observed, and complicated to administer. It is both, Dr. Williams confirmed, which is why most foundations don't attempt it. But Grace Memorial seems to have unlimited resources and remarkable attention to detail. How unlimited? David's question was casual, but I could see the wheels turning behind his eyes. Unlimited resources represented opportunity, even if he couldn't immediately identify what that opportunity might be. This year alone, they've committed over $12 million to Northwestern's pediatric oncology program, James said. And we know they're funding similar programs at Children's Hospital of Philadelphia, St. Jude, and Mayo Clinic. David's eyebrows rose slightly. $12 million was serious money, even by his standards. That's a substantial commitment. Someone with that kind of resources should be on everyone's radar. Which brings us back to the mystery, James said. How does someone donate that much money while remaining completely invisible to the philanthropic community? Maybe they're not from the philanthropic community, I suggested. Maybe they're someone who built wealth in a different sector and decided to use it for medical research. Possibly, James agreed. Though the level of sophistication in their grant requirements suggests someone with deep knowledge of healthcare systems, this isn't just wealthy person writing checks. This is someone who understands research methodology, patient care protocols, and the economics of treatment delivery. Dr. Williams nodded emphatically. The questions they ask through their lawyers are incredibly informed. Last month they requested detailed information about how we plan to integrate new genetic testing protocols with existing insurance approval processes. That's not the kind of question you ask unless you really understand both the science and the business of healthcare. I remembered that conversation with James Rothschild, explaining why I needed to understand how insurance companies would respond to new testing procedures before committing funding to research that might never reach patients because of bureaucratic obstacles. Emma's treatment had been delayed twice while our insurance company debated coverage for procedures that might have saved her life if implemented sooner. It sounds like whoever runs Grace Memorial has direct experience with pediatric CRs. Cancer treatment, James observed. That would make sense, Dr. Williams agreed. Someone who's watched a child go through treatment would understand all the ways our current system fails families. David was listening to this conversation with the focused attention he usually reserved for business deals that might prove profitable. Have you considered hiring a private investigator? If this foundation is as important to your research as you're suggesting, it might be worth understanding who you're really working with. The suggestion was so casually predatory that I felt my stomach tighten. David's instinct, when presented with an entity that couldn't be immediately categorized and leveraged, was to investigate and expose it. That seems rather invasive, Dr. Williams said, clearly uncomfortable with the idea. It's practical, David replied. You're accepting millions of dollars from someone you know nothing about. What if there are strings attached that aren't immediately obvious? What if their money comes from questionable sources? What if they're using charitable donations to manipulate research outcomes for personal benefit? James Morrison looked thoughtful. Those are legitimate concerns in principle, though Grace Memorial's requirements actually push research toward more open and accessible outcomes, not less. Still, David pressed, transparency works both ways. If they want detailed reporting on how their money gets used, shouldn't you know something about where that money comes from? I could see the appeal of David's logic, especially for people who worked in fields where accountability and transparency were professional requirements. The idea that a foundation could operate with complete anonymity while demanding detailed oversight of the research they funded would naturally create curiosity and some suspicion. We've considered it, Dr. Williams admitted. But Grace Memorial has been such a positive force in pediatric cancer research that investigation feels like looking a gift horse in the mouth. Besides, James added, their funding agreements include provisions for independent auditing of their own financial practices. They're not hiding their money management, they're just keeping their leadership private. This was news to me. I'd authorized those auditing provisions on James Rothschild's recommendation, but I'd never seen the actual reports. The idea that my financial practices were being independently verified while I sat here listening to people discuss the mystery of my identity was both reassuring and terrifying. Independent auditing by whom? David asked. Ernst & Young handles their financial oversight, James replied. Same firm that audits our pharmaceutical operations. They confirmed that Grace Memorial's funding comes from legitimate investment returns and poses no ethical concerns for research partnerships. David fell quiet, processing this information. I could see him weighing the challenge of investigating an entity that had apparently anticipated and addressed the usual concerns about anonymous charitable giving. It's frustrating, he said finally. In my business, we succeed by understanding all the players in any given market. Anonymous actors create unpredictability. In medical research, we succeed by focusing on outcomes rather than personalities, Dr. Williams replied with gentle firmness. Grace Memorial's anonymity has never interfered with their effectiveness as a funding partner. But aren't you curious? David persisted. Doesn't some part of you want to know who's been so generous to your research program? Dr. Williams smiled. Of course I'm curious, but I'm also grateful. Whoever leads Grace Memorial has transformed our ability to provide comprehensive care to pediatric cancer patients. Their support has directly contributed to better outcomes for hundreds of children over the past 3 years. Hundreds of children who are alive today because of research that might not have been funded otherwise, James added. In that context, the foundation director's desire for privacy seems like a small concession. I felt tears threatening and had to look down at my barely touched dinner to compose myself. These people, these strangers who didn't know my name or my story, understood exactly what I'd been trying to accomplish with Grace Memorial. They saw the work the way I saw it, as a direct extension of love for children who deserved better than the healthcare system could provide without additional support. That's a beautiful way to think about it, I managed to say without my voice breaking. David looked at me with surprise, as if he'd forgotten I was still part of this conversation. "Sarah, you're crying." "It's just moving," I said, wiping my eyes with my napkin. "Hearing about research that's actually helping families." "You're very empathetic," Dr. Williams observed kindly. "That's probably what makes you effective in patient advocacy work." David's expression suggested he found this level of emotional response excessive and embarrassing. Sarah has always been sensitive about medical issues. Emma's death affected her deeply. The way he said it made my sensitivity sound like a character flaw, something that interfered with rational thinking, rather than informed it. David had attended Emma's funeral and returned to work the following Monday, filing her death under personal tragedy, overcome through professional focus. He'd never understood that my sensitivity was actually intimate knowledge of a healthcare system that failed too many families in too many ways. "Sensitivity informed by experience is invaluable in healthcare," James said firmly. "Some of our most successful patient-centered initiatives have come from people who understand treatment from the family perspective, like the family support programs that Grace Memorial requires in their funding agreements," Dr. Williams added. "Those requirements could only have been written by someone who really understood what families need during treatment." I felt the conversation circling dangerously close to revelations I wasn't prepared to make, at least not while David was standing there ready to weaponize any information against me. "It sounds like Grace Memorial's director might be someone like Sarah," James said thoughtfully. "Someone with medical training who left the field after a personal experience with pediatric cancer." The observation was so accurate that I had to fight to keep my expression neutral. James Morrison was clearly intelligent, observant, and accustomed to solving complex puzzles. His casual analysis had just outlined my exact background with startling precision. That would explain the combination of medical knowledge and patient advocacy focus, Dr. Williams agreed, and the emphasis on comprehensive family support. David was studying me with an expression I couldn't quite read. "Sarah, you should really consider reaching out to Grace Memorial. It sounds like they might appreciate your background and perspective." The irony was so perfect that I almost laughed. David was suggesting that I should seek employment with myself, having spent the past hour dismissing my qualifications for any meaningful work while simultaneously listening to healthcare professionals describe exactly the kind of work I'd been doing anonymously for years. "I might look into that," I said diplomatically. "You should," James encouraged. "Even if they're not hiring, they might be able to connect you with other organizations doing similar work. Or they might be willing to fund independent patient advocacy projects," Dr. Williams suggested. "Grace Memorial has been interested in supporting comprehensive approaches to pediatric cancer care." I was trapped in an increasingly surreal conversation where people were encouraging me to apply for funding from myself, while my brother nodded along with advice about how I should attempt to leverage my limited qualifications into meaningful work. "That's an excellent suggestion," David said, apparently warming to the idea that I might finally find appropriate employment. Sarah could write a proposal outlining her experience and her ideas for improving patient advocacy services. Grace Memorial responds very positively to proposals that demonstrate deep understanding of family needs, James confirmed. "I'll definitely consider it," I said, wondering how I could extract myself from this conversation before it became even more absurd. But James Morrison wasn't finished with his analysis. "Sarah, can I ask you something specific about your patient advocacy work?" I nodded, though I was beginning to feel like someone walking across a frozen lake while hearing the ice crack beneath my feet. "Have you ever worked with families dealing with acute lymphoblastic leukemia specifically?" The question hit me like a physical blow. All was Emma's diagnosis, the specific form of childhood cancer that had killed my sister and motivated everything I'd done since her death. James couldn't have known to ask that question unless he suspected something more than casual interest in my background. "Yes," I said carefully. "Some. The reason I ask," James continued, "is that Grace Memorial's most recent funding cycle included a specific focus on all research. Their requirements document mention protocols for families dealing with relapsed all cases, which is incredibly specialized knowledge." Dr. Williams nodded. The level of detail was extraordinary. Whoever wrote those requirements had clearly dealt with the specific challenges of all treatment failure and recovery. I felt the walls closing in around my carefully maintained anonymity. Emma had relapsed twice during her treatment, and each relapse had taught me more about the inadequacies of existing protocols and support systems. When I wrote Grace Memorial's funding requirements for all research, I'd been thinking specifically about families facing the particular hell of watching treatment fail and having to start over with experimental options and decreasing odds of success. "That's very specialized," I agreed, my voice sounding strange to my own ears. "Suspiciously specialized," James said quietly, his eyes fixed on my face with uncomfortable intensity. The silence that followed felt different from the earlier awkward pauses. This silence felt like the moment before a revelation, the pause that happens when someone realizes they've been missing something important that was hiding in plain sight. David sensed the shift in energy even if he didn't understand its source. "Is everything all right?" Dr. Williams was studying me with the same focused attention that James had been showing, as if she too was beginning to piece together a puzzle she hadn't realized she was solving. "Sarah," she said slowly, "how long did you say you've been doing patient advocacy work?" "I didn't say specifically," I replied, aware that my evasion was probably more revealing than a direct answer would have been. "Because if you've been working in pediatric cancer advocacy for several years," James said carefully, "and if you have specific experience with all cases, and if you understand research methodology well enough to discuss genetic marker studies, then you might be exactly the kind of person Grace Memorial looks for when they're evaluating potential partners." The observation was delivered like a statement, but it was really a question. James Morrison had just laid out the logical connections between my background and Grace Memorial's requirements, and he was waiting to see how I responded to his analysis. I looked around the table at three faces showing varying degrees of curiosity, suspicion, and dawning recognition. David looked confused but alert, sensing that something significant was happening without understanding what. Dr. Williams looked thoughtful and intrigued, as if she were reconsidering everything I'd said during our conversation. And James Morrison looked like a man who'd just solved a puzzle and was waiting for confirmation that his solution was correct. The moment stretched between us like a taut wire, loaded with potential for revelation or denial, truth or continued performance. I could feel my carefully constructed anonymity beginning to crumble under the weight of their combined attention and analysis. And in that suspended moment before everything changed, I realized that part of me was ready for the truth to come out. The taut wire of tension snapped when Margaret Sullivan's voice echoed through the ballroom sound system, calling everyone's attention to the podium for the evening's special announcements. I felt a mixture of relief and dread as the spotlight shifted away from our table, giving me a temporary reprieve from James Morrison's increasingly pointed questions, while simultaneously moving us toward what I knew would be the evening's climactic moment. "Ladies and gentlemen," Margaret began, her voice warm and commanding, "we have reached the most exciting part of our evening. Tonight, we're not just celebrating the progress we've made in pediatric cancer research, we're announcing a partnership that will transform how we approach childhood cancer treatment for decades to come." The ballroom fell silent except for the soft clink of wine glasses being set down, and the rustle of formal attire as 800 people turned their attention to the stage. At our table, David straightened in his chair, always alert to announcements. that might present networking opportunities or business implications. Over the past 5 years, Margaret continued, the Chicago Medical Research Foundation has been privileged to work with a remarkable partner whose vision and generosity have enabled breakthrough advances in pediatric oncology research. Tonight, for the first time, we're able to publicly acknowledge the full scope of this extraordinary collaboration. I felt my heart rate accelerate as I realized that Margaret was about to deviate from the script I'd approved through James Rothschild's office. We'd agreed that tonight's announcement would focus on the new research center without identifying Grace Memorial's leadership. This felt different, more personal, more revealing than anything I'd authorized. The Grace Memorial Research Foundation has provided over $18 million in funding to Northwestern Medicine's pediatric oncology program, Margaret announced, her voice building with emotion. This support has enabled us to develop new treatment protocols, expand our clinical trial programs, and provide comprehensive care services to hundreds of families facing childhood cancer. The applause was immediate and sustained, rolling through the ballroom like thunder. At our table, James Morrison and Dr. Williams clapped enthusiastically, while David nodded with the appreciation of someone recognizing a significant business achievement. But I could see James watching me peripherally, his attention divided between the stage and my reaction. But tonight's announcement goes beyond celebrating past achievements, Margaret continued as the applause faded. Tonight, we're unveiling the Grace Memorial Center for Pediatric Cancer Research, a state-of-the-art facility that will integrate cutting-edge research with comprehensive family support services. This center represents the largest single commitment to pediatric cancer research in Chicago's history. More applause, this time mixed with excited murmurs as people began to understand the magnitude of what was being announced. I watched David's face as he processed the financial implications of what Margaret was describing. $18 million plus the cost of a new research center represented the kind of philanthropic commitment that commanded respect, even from people who measured success exclusively in financial terms. The Grace Memorial Center will open next fall with a unique mission, Margaret went on. Every family served by our program will receive not just world-class medical treatment, but also educational support, financial counseling, mental health services, and long-term follow-up care. This comprehensive approach represents a new standard for pediatric cancer treatment. Dr. Williams leaned toward our table. This is exactly what we've been working toward for years. Comprehensive care that addresses the whole family's needs, not just the patient's medical requirements. It's revolutionary, James agreed quietly. Most research facilities focus exclusively on the science. Integrating family support services at this level will change everything about how treatment gets delivered. I listened to them praise the Yakshi vision I'd spent 3 years developing while my stomach churned with anticipation about what Margaret might say next. Through James Rothschild's office, I'd been assured that my anonymity would be protected even during tonight's announcement. But Margaret's tone suggested she was building towards something more personal than a simple acknowledgement of Grace Memorial's support. The Grace Memorial Foundation's approach to pediatric cancer research has been shaped by a deeply personal understanding of what families endure during treatment, Margaret continued. Their funding requirements reflect intimate knowledge of the gaps in our current healthcare system and genuine compassion for the families navigating those gaps. David was nodding along, probably thinking about how he might position himself to connect with Grace Memorial's leadership for potential business opportunities. But James Morrison was studying me with increasing intensity, as if Margaret's words were confirming suspicions he'd been developing throughout our conversation. Which brings me to tonight's most special announcement, Margaret said, her voice shifting to a more intimate tone. For 5 years, the Grace Memorial Foundation has chosen to remain anonymous, working through intermediaries to protect their privacy while supporting our mission. But recently, they've agreed to let us share their story, because they believe that understanding the personal motivation behind their philanthropy might inspire others to support pediatric cancer research. My blood turned to ice water. This was not part of any agreement I'd made with Margaret or the foundation. Whatever was about to happen, I'd lost control of it completely. The Grace Memorial Research Foundation was established by a young woman who lost her sister to acute lymphoblastic leukemia 8 years ago, Margaret announced. She watched her family struggle not just with the medical challenges of childhood cancer, but with navigating insurance systems, understanding treatment options, managing financial pressures, and finding emotional support during the most difficult experience of their lives. The ballroom was absolutely silent now. 800 people listening to Margaret tell my story without using my name. At our table, I could feel James Morrison's eyes boring into me, while Dr. Williams had gone, very still with the kind of attention that suggested she was making connections she'd missed before. Rather than pursue traditional medical training, this remarkable woman chose to become an expert in patient advocacy and healthcare systems. She built a consulting practice that helps families navigate pediatric cancer treatment, and she's used the financial success of that practice to fund the research and support services she wishes had been available to her own family. David was listening with the kind of focused attention he usually reserved for business presentations that might affect his professional interests. I could see him processing the information, probably calculating the financial implications of building a consulting practice successful enough to fund $18 million in charitable giving. The Grace Memorial Foundation's director has asked to remain personally anonymous, Margaret continued, but she wanted me to share this message. Emma Chen died on March 15, 2016, after fighting leukemia for 18 months. She was 13 years old, and she loved astronomy and chocolate chip cookies and terrible pop music. This research center exists because Emma's fight taught us that childhood cancer treatment must address not just the disease, but the whole family's journey through diagnosis, treatment, and either recovery or loss. The silence that followed Margaret's words was profound and heavy. The kind of silence that happens when a room full of people suddenly understands that they're witnessing something deeply personal and sacred. I felt tears streaming down my face as Margaret read the message I'd written 6 months ago, never imagining it would be shared in a ballroom full of strangers while I sat listening to my own story being told. But Margaret wasn't finished. Tonight, Grace Memorial's director has agreed to step forward and accept our recognition for her extraordinary commitment to pediatric cancer research. Ladies and gentlemen, please join me in welcoming Sarah Chen, founder and director of the Grace Memorial Research Foundation. The spotlight found me immediately, a bright white circle that turned everyone in the ballroom into shadowy figures while illuminating me like an actor on a stage. The applause began slowly, then built to a sustained ovation as 800 people rose to their feet in recognition of something they were just beginning to understand. At our table, 3 very different reactions unfolded in slow motion. Dr. Williams was clapping with tears in her eyes, her face showing the kind of recognition that comes when pieces of a puzzle suddenly arrange themselves into a complete picture. James Morrison was applauding while nodding slowly, as if confirming a hypothesis he'd been testing throughout our conversation. And David was sitting perfectly still, his hands frozen halfway to clapping position, his face cycling through expressions of confusion, disbelief, and something that might have been calculation as he tried to process what he'd just learned about his supposedly unsuccessful sister. I stood slowly, my legs unsteady beneath me, and walked toward the stage through a sea of applauding strangers who now knew my name and my story. The walk felt endless, each step carrying me further from the anonymity I'd protected for 8 years and closer to a spotlight I'd never wanted, but suddenly realized I was ready to accept. Margaret embraced me as I reached the podium, whispering, "I hope you'll forgive me for changing our agreement. Your story needs to be told." I took the microphone with hands that were steadier than I'd expected, looking out over a ballroom full of people who were still applauding. In the back corner, I could see table 52, where I'd been sitting anonymously just an hour ago, and in the front section, I could see table 7, where David sat staring at me with an expression I couldn't read from the stage. "Thank you," I said, my voice carrying clearly through the sound system. "This evening has been unexpected." Soft laughter rippled through the crowd, the kind of sympathetic amusement that acknowledged the obvious difficulty of my situation. "Emma would have been 21 this year," I continued, finding my footing as I spoke about my sister to a room full of strangers. "She would have been finishing college, probably majoring in something completely impractical like art history or philosophy, definitely dating someone we'd all pretend to like while secretly hoping she'd find someone better." More laughter, warmer this time, as people connected with the universal experience of loving someone whose choices you don't always understand, but support anyway. Emma died because the treatments available to her weren't good enough. Not because her doctors weren't skilled enough, or because her family didn't fight hard enough, or because she didn't want to live badly enough. She died because pediatric cancer research was underfunded and patient support services were inadequate, and families like ours were left to navigate an impossible system during the worst experience of our lives. The ballroom was absolutely silent again, but this silence felt different. This was the silence of people listening to truth being spoken about something they'd previously understood only in abstract terms. The Grace Memorial Research Foundation exists because no family should have to choose between the best available treatment and financial stability. No child should receive substandard care because their parents don't understand how to advocate effectively within complex medical systems. No sibling should watch their family fall apart under the pressure of navigating pediatric cancer treatment without comprehensive support. I paused, looking out over faces that were no longer anonymous, but were individuals listening to something personal and important. The research center we're announcing tonight will provide not just cutting-edge medical treatment, but everything families need to survive the experience of childhood cancer. Education, financial support, mental health services, sibling support, and long-term follow-up care. It will treat the whole family, not just the patient, because childhood cancer is a family disease that requires family-centered treatment. The applause began again, but I raised my hand to continue speaking. I've remained anonymous for 8 years because I believed the work was more important than recognition. Tonight, I'm accepting public acknowledgement because I've learned that stories matter. Emma's story matters. Your stories matter. The families we serve need to know that the people funding their treatment understand their experience intimately. I found David in the crowd, his face still showing that unreadable mixture of emotions. I've also learned that hiding achievements doesn't protect you from other people's assumptions about your worth. For 8 years, I've let people believe I was unsuccessful because I thought it was easier than explaining why I chose a different definition of success. But silence gives other people permission to write your story for you, and they rarely write it with accuracy or kindness. The truth of that statement hung in the air like smoke, visible and undeniable. Emma taught me that life is too short and too precious to spend it apologizing for choices that matter deeply to you. The Grace Memorial Research Foundation represents 8 years of choosing impact over recognition, families over profit, and meaningful work over social approval. I'm not apologizing for any of those choices. The applause this time was immediate and sustained, a standing ovation that felt different from the earlier recognition. This applause felt like validation, like acknowledgement not just of my philanthropy, but of my right to define success on my own terms. As I handed the microphone back to Margaret and walked off the stage, I felt something I hadn't experienced in 8 years. Complete alignment between my public identity and my private reality. The weight I'd been carrying, the exhaustion of maintaining 2 separate lives, lifted from my shoulders as I walked back through the applauding crowd toward a table where 3 people were waiting to have very different conversations with me. Dr. Williams was the first to speak as I reached our table. "Sarah, I can't believe we've been corresponding through lawyers for 3 years. Your questions, your insights, your funding requirements, they've shaped everything we've accomplished in pediatric oncology research. Every family we've helped has benefited from your understanding of what they actually need, James Morrison added, his earlier suspicion replaced by genuine admiration. Your comprehensive approach to patient support has become the gold standard for pediatric cancer treatment. I sat down slowly, still adjusting to the reality that my secret was now public knowledge shared by 800 people and growing. Thank you, I said simply. Both of you do incredible work. I'm honored to support it. David hadn't spoken yet. He was staring at me with an expression that seemed to shift between amazement, confusion, and something that might have been resentment. $18 million, he said finally. 23 million, actually, I corrected. Tonight's announcement was about the Chicago commitment. Grace Memorial funds pediatric cancer research in 7 cities. David's face went very still as he processed this information. $23 million. You've donated $23 million. Over 5 years, I clarified. It's not like I wrote one check. Where did you get $23 million, Sarah? The question was asked quietly, but it carried weight. David was struggling to reconcile the sister he thought he knew, the family disappointment who lived in a tiny apartment and worked odd jobs, with someone who'd apparently built enough wealth to become a major philanthropist. I built a consulting practice, I said. Patient advocacy work, healthcare systems analysis, insurance navigation support. It grew faster than I expected. Patient advocacy doesn't generate that kind of money, David stated flatly. It does when you're really good at it, and you understand systems that most people find incomprehensible, I replied. It does when pharmaceutical companies and insurance providers and hospital systems pay you to help them improve patient outcomes and reduce costs. It does when you work 80-hour weeks for 8 years, because the work matters more than anything else in your life. James Morrison nodded. Healthcare systems consulting is incredibly lucrative for people with the right expertise. Sarah's background gives her insights that most consultants can't match. But you live in that tiny apartment, David protested. You drive a 10-year-old Honda. You dress like. He gestured at my simple black dress, apparently unable to articulate what my clothing choices represented to him. Like someone who doesn't need material possessions to feel successful? I suggested. Like someone who'd rather spend money on research that saves children's lives than on designer handbags and luxury cars? David was quiet for a long moment, his face showing the kind of internal struggle that happens when fundamental assumptions about reality suddenly prove false. Why didn't you tell us? He asked finally. Why let us think you were struggling? It was a fair question, and one I'd been asking myself for months as the burden of maintaining my double life had grown heavier. Because telling you would have changed everything, I said. Suddenly, I would have been successful enough to deserve respect. My opinions would have mattered because I had money to back them up. People would have wanted to be associated with my achievements. What's wrong with that? David asked, genuinely confused. Nothing, necessarily. But I wanted to know who I was when success wasn't visible, when people had no reason to treat me well except basic human decency. I wanted to understand how I felt about myself when external validation wasn't available. Dr. Williams was listening with the kind of attention that suggested she understood exactly what I was describing. "And what did you learn?" she asked gently. "I learned that I don't need other people's approval to feel good about my choices. I learned that meaningful work provides its own satisfaction, regardless of whether anyone acknowledges it. I learned that being underestimated can be a tremendous advantage when you're trying to accomplish something important." I looked directly at David. I also learned that some people will only value your contributions after they discover you have money. And I learned that discovering who those people are can be both painful and necessary. The truth of that statement settled over our table like fog, heavy and unavoidable. David's face showed that he understood my implication, that he recognized himself in my description of people whose respect was contingent on financial success. "Sarah, I never meant to," he began, then stopped, apparently realizing that apologizing for years of dismissive treatment wasn't something that could be accomplished in a single sentence. "I know you didn't mean to be cruel," I said, "but impact matters more than intention. For 8 years, you've treated me like a failure who needed your charity and guidance. You've dismissed my work, questioned my choices, and suggested that I was taking up space without contributing anything meaningful." The silence that followed was heavy with recognition and regret. "Tonight, you discovered that the person you've been dismissing as unsuccessful has actually built something extraordinary. Not just the financial success, but work that directly improves children's lives. Work that matters in ways that stock portfolios and corporate acquisitions never will." David nodded slowly, his face showing genuine remorse for the first time in our adult relationship. "I was wrong about you," he said quietly. "I was wrong about everything." "You were wrong about what success looks like," I corrected. "You assumed that achievements had to be visible and profitable to be meaningful. You assumed that because my life didn't look like yours, it must be less valuable." James Morrison and Dr. Williams were listening to this conversation with the kind of attention usually reserved for significant moments, understanding that they were witnessing something important being resolved between siblings who'd lost their way with each other years ago. "How do we fix this?" David asked. It was a good question, and one I'd been thinking about for months as I'd grown increasingly tired of maintaining the pretense that his opinion of me mattered. "We start by being honest," I said. "I stop pretending to be unsuccessful to protect your ego, and you stop assuming that your definition of success is the only one that matters. And then we see if we can build a relationship based on who we actually are instead of who we thought each other should be." David nodded, his expression showing the kind of seriousness that suggested he understood this was a pivotal moment in our relationship. "I'd like that," he said. Around us, the gala was continuing with dessert service and the silent auction. But our table had become its own small world where a family was renegotiating the terms of love and respect and recognition. As the evening wound down, I found myself surrounded by people who wanted to discuss future collaborations, research funding opportunities, and partnership possibilities. The conversation was energizing in a way I hadn't expected, focused on work that mattered rather than social pleasantries and networking strategies. When David approached as I was saying goodbye to Dr. Williams and James Morrison, his expression was different from any I'd seen from him before. More humble, more uncertain, more genuine. "Sarah, would you have dinner with me this week? Not a family obligation or a social event, just dinner, so we can talk about who you really are and what you've accomplished." I studied his face, looking for signs of the calculation and conditional respect that had characterized our interactions for years. Instead, I saw something that looked like genuine curiosity and remorse. "I'd like that," I said. As I walked out of the Fairmont that night, I realized that the spotlight had done more than expose my secret philanthropic work. It had illuminated the difference between relationships based on performance and those based on authentic recognition of each other's worth. For 8 years, I'd hidden my success to avoid being valued for the wrong reasons. Tonight, I'd learned that being valued for the right reasons required being willing to be seen clearly, completely, and without apology. Emma would have been proud. 3 days after the gala, I sat in my Lincoln Park apartment watching the morning sun stream through windows that overlooked a city I'd been quietly reshaping for years. The space that David had once dismissed as proof of my limited ambitions now felt like a sanctuary where I could process the seismic shift that had occurred. When Margaret Sullivan spoke my name into that spotlight, my phone had been ringing constantly since Saturday night. Journalists wanting interviews about anonymous philanthropy and the psychology of hidden success. Medical researchers seeking funding for projects that might not have crossed my desk for months under the old system. Pharmaceutical executives who'd been trying to reach Grace Memorial's leadership for years and now knew exactly who to call. Most surprising were the personal calls. Family members who'd heard about the gala through David or seen the Tribune's front-page story about Chicago's mystery philanthropist being revealed as the sister everyone had written off as unsuccessful. Cousins who remembered me as the quiet one at family gatherings, suddenly recalling conversations where I'd asked detailed questions about their children's health issues or shown unusual interest in medical topics. My mother had called Tuesday morning, her voice carrying a mixture of pride and bewilderment that I recognized from my childhood when I'd surprised her with unexpected achievements. "Sarah, honey, I don't understand how this happened without us knowing," she'd said. $23 million? Where did you get $23 million? The question everyone kept asking, as if wealth that significant had to come from inheritance or lottery winnings, rather than the methodical building of something valuable over time. I'd explained again about the consulting practice, about how patient advocacy had evolved into healthcare systems analysis, about how companies would pay substantial fees for expertise that could save them millions in inefficient processes and regulatory compliance issues. "But why didn't you tell us you were successful?" she'd asked, the hurt evident in her voice. It was the same question David had posed at the gala, and one I'd been answering repeatedly since Saturday night. The honest answer was complicated, and probably more painful than most people were prepared to hear. I hadn't told them because their treatment of me when they thought I was unsuccessful had revealed something about their values that I wasn't sure I wanted to confront directly. I wanted to focus on the work rather than the recognition, I'd told my mother, which was true even if it wasn't the complete truth. Now, sitting in my apartment with a cup of coffee and the morning paper featuring my photograph above the fold, I was trying to process what my life would look like going forward. The anonymity that had protected my work for 8 years was gone permanently. Grace Memorial would continue operating, but every funding decision would now be public knowledge. Every research partnership would be scrutinized for personal motivations. Every grant would be analyzed through the lens of my family's experience with pediatric cancer. The loss of privacy felt profound, but it was balanced by something unexpected: relief. For 8 years, I'd been carrying the weight of 2 separate identities, constantly calculating how much truth I could reveal without exposing the careful structure I'd built around my real work. That burden was gone now, lifted by Margaret Sullivan's announcement and my decision to embrace rather than resist the spotlight. My laptop chimed with a calendar reminder about lunch with David. We'd arranged to meet at a small restaurant in River North, neutral territory, where we could have the conversation we should have had years ago about who we'd become as adults, and whether we could build something better than the relationship we'd been maintaining through obligation and family gatherings. I chose my clothes carefully for this lunch, not because I was trying to impress David, but because I was still learning how to present myself as someone who no longer needed to hide her achievements. For 8 years, I'd dressed to be invisible, to avoid drawing attention that might lead to questions about my work or my financial situation. Now I was learning to dress like someone who commanded respect through her accomplishments rather than deflecting attention to avoid unwanted scrutiny. The restaurant David had chosen was the kind of place where business deals were discussed over expensive steaks and wine that cost more per bottle than most people spent on groceries in a month. It was his natural habitat, a space where success was measured by the price of your watch and the prominence of your table reservation. I arrived exactly on time to find David already seated at a corner table, studying his phone with the focused attention he usually reserved for market reports and acquisition analyses. He looked up as I approached, and I saw something in his expression that I'd never seen before: uncertainty about how to interact with me. "Sarah," he said, standing to embrace me in a gesture that felt both familiar and completely foreign. "Thank you for agreeing to do this." We sat down across from each other in the kind of awkward silence that happens between people who've known each other forever, but suddenly realize they don't know each other at all. "How are you handling everything?" David asked. "The media? Attention? The phone calls? The sudden publicity?" It was a reasonable question from someone who understood how dramatically public exposure could change someone's life. David had been profiled in business publications, quoted in newspaper articles about healthcare acquisitions, featured in industry magazines as a rising star in private equity. He understood the strange experience of having strangers know things about your professional life while remaining ignorant about who you actually were as a person. "It's overwhelming," I admitted. "I never wanted to be a public figure. The whole point of Grace Memorial's structure was to keep the focus on the work rather than the person funding it." David nodded thoughtfully. "I've been thinking about that since Saturday night. Why did you choose anonymity? Most philanthropists want recognition for their giving." It was the same question everyone had been asking. But coming from David, it carried additional weight because our relationship had been shaped by his assumption that success without recognition was essentially meaningless. Recognition changes the dynamic, I explained. When people know you have money, they treat you differently. They want things from you. They assume your opinions matter because you can afford to back them up with financial support. "Isn't that how influence works?" David asked. "Money gives you a platform to advocate for causes you care about." But I didn't want to advocate for causes. I wanted to solve problems. When you're known as a major donor, people tell you what they think you want to hear. When you're anonymous, they tell you what's actually happening. David was listening with the kind of attention that suggested he was genuinely trying to understand something that challenged his fundamental assumptions about how success and influence operated. For 8 years, I've been working with hospitals, research facilities, pharmaceutical companies, and insurance providers who had no idea they were dealing with a major philanthropist, I continued. They gave me honest assessments of their challenges, their failures, their need for resources. They didn't polish their presentations or hide their problems or try to impress me with superficial achievements. "And that information helped you make better funding decisions," David said slowly. "It helped me understand what families actually need instead of what institutions think they need. Most charitable giving in healthcare is reactive, responding to requests from established organizations with traditional approaches to problem solving. I wanted to be proactive, identifying gaps in care and funding solutions that institutions hadn't thought to request." David was quiet for several minutes, processing this information while studying the menu with more attention than wine selections typically required. "I think I'm beginning to understand why you didn't tell us about Grace Memorial," he said eventually, "but I still don't understand why you let us believe you were struggling financially." This was the harder question, the one that required me to be honest about how his treatment of me had influenced my choices about what to reveal and what to protect. "Because your respect was conditional on my success," I said quietly. "And I wanted to know who I was when that respect wasn't available." David's face showed that he understood exactly what I was saying, even if he didn't like the implications. "I never meant to make my respect conditional," he said. "But you did. For 8 years, you've treated me like a failure who needed your guidance and charity. You've dismissed my work, questioned my choices, and suggested that I was taking up space without contributing anything meaningful to family conversations or social situations." The words hung between us like a challenge, unavoidable and uncomfortable. "You were right that I was exploring my options and figuring out my path," I continued. "But you assumed that exploration meant failure instead of recognizing it as the process of building something unprecedented." David nodded slowly, his expression showing genuine remorse. "I was wrong," he said simply. "I was wrong about your work, wrong about your choices, wrong about what success looks like." "You were operating from a narrow definition of achievement," I replied. "You assumed that career success had to be visible, profitable, and socially prestigious to be meaningful." "Because that's how I was taught to measure worth," David admitted. "Salary, title, office location. public recognition. Those were the metrics I learned to value. And when my life didn't fit those metrics, you concluded that I wasn't succeeding rather than questioning whether the metrics might be incomplete. David was quiet for a long time, staring at his water glass as if it contained solutions to complex problems. "How do I fix this?" he asked finally. "How do I learn to value work that doesn't fit traditional definitions of success?" It was a good question, and one that required him to examine assumptions he'd probably never thought to challenge. "You start by asking different questions," I suggested. "Instead of asking how much money someone makes, ask what kind of impact their work has on other people's lives. Instead of asking about job titles and office locations, ask about job satisfaction and personal fulfillment. And instead of assuming that invisible work is less important than visible work," David added, showing that he was beginning to understand the broader implications of what I was describing. "Exactly. Some of the most important work in the world happens quietly, without applause or recognition. Teachers shaping children's futures, social workers protecting vulnerable families, researchers developing treatments for rare diseases, advocates fighting for policy changes that won't be implemented for decades." David nodded thoughtfully. "Like patient advocacy for pediatric cancer families." "Like patient advocacy for pediatric cancer families," I confirmed. Our conversation was interrupted by the arrival of our server, a young woman who recognized David from previous visits and treated him with the kind of professional warmth reserved for regular customers who tipped well. She didn't recognize me, which felt refreshing after 3 days of being approached by strangers who'd read about me in the newspaper. After we ordered, David returned to the subject that was clearly occupying most of his thoughts. "Sarah, I need to ask you something, and I want you to be completely honest with me." I nodded, preparing myself for whatever uncomfortable question he was working up the courage to pose. "Did you keep your success secret because you were punishing us for not supporting you when you left medical school?" The question was more perceptive than I'd expected, and it required me to examine motivations I hadn't fully acknowledged even to myself. "Partially," I admitted. I was hurt by how quickly everyone assumed I was giving up rather than choosing a different path. When I left medical school to care for Emma and figure out how to navigate her treatment, the family response was disappointment rather than recognition that I was taking responsibility for something important. David's face showed that he remembered those conversations, probably with more clarity than he was comfortable acknowledging. And when Emma died and I decided not to return to medical school, everyone treated that choice like evidence of my inability to recover from tragedy, rather than recognition that I'd learned something more valuable than anything medical school could teach me. What had you learned? That the healthcare system fails families in systematic ways that could be addressed if someone cared enough to understand the problems and committed enough resources to solving them. David was listening with complete attention now, as if he was finally hearing something he should have asked about years ago. "So yes," I continued, "part of me wanted to prove that I could build something meaningful without anyone's support or approval. Part of me wanted to demonstrate that the family member you'd written off as unsuccessful was actually more successful than any of you had imagined. And the other part? The other part genuinely believed that the work was more important than the recognition. Every dollar I spent on Grace Memorial's publicity or social events was a dollar not going to research that could save children's lives." David absorbed this information quietly, probably calculating the implications of what I was describing. $23 million, he said eventually. "In 8 years, you built a consulting practice that generated enough profit to donate $23 million while maintaining your living expenses." Actually, 31 million, I corrected. 23 million through Grace Memorial, but I've also been funding smaller advocacy organizations and providing direct financial assistance to families facing treatment costs their insurance won't cover. David's expression showed that he was struggling to process the magnitude of what I'd accomplished. $31 million in charitable giving, he repeated. Sarah, do you understand how extraordinary that is? It's what happens when you build a business around solving problems people will pay significant amounts of money to have solved, I replied. Healthcare systems waste billions of dollars annually on inefficient processes, regulatory compliance, failures, and patient care protocols that don't address actual patient needs. Companies will pay substantial consulting fees to experts who can identify those inefficiencies and design better systems. But most consultants keep the money they earn, David pointed out. Most consultants don't have a dead sister whose treatment taught them exactly how those inefficiencies translate into human suffering, I replied. The truth of that statement settled over our table like a weight that couldn't be lifted or ignored. Emma's death wasn't just a personal tragedy, I continued. It was an education in how healthcare systems fail when they're designed around institutional needs rather than patient outcomes. Every dollar I've donated through Grace Memorial represents something I wish had been available to our family during Emma's treatment. David was quiet for several minutes, and when he spoke again, his voice carried a different quality than I'd heard from him before. I never asked you what Emma's treatment was like, he said. I never asked what you learned during those 18 months, or how it affected your understanding of healthcare, or why you chose patient advocacy over traditional medical training. You never asked because you assumed those experiences had broken me rather than educated me, I replied gently. I was wrong, David said simply. I was wrong about everything. Our food arrived, providing a natural pause in a conversation that was proving more emotionally demanding than either of us had anticipated. We ate in comfortable silence for several minutes, both processing what had been said and what still needed to be addressed. What happens now? David asked eventually. With Grace Memorial, with your consulting practice, with your relationship to the family? Grace Memorial continues operating, but with public, rather than anonymous leadership. The consulting practice will probably change as clients realize they're working with someone who's been featured on the front page of the Tribune. And the family relationship depends on whether people can learn to see me as I actually am, rather than as they assumed I was. David nodded slowly. And our relationship specifically? It was the question I'd been dreading and anticipating since Saturday night. Our relationship depends on whether you can respect work that doesn't fit your traditional definition of success, and whether I can forgive 8 years of feeling invisible and dismissed by someone whose opinion I still care about despite everything. I want to try, David said. I want to learn how to see success the way you see it. And I want to understand the work you've been doing rather than making assumptions about its value. And I want to stop hiding achievements because I'm afraid of how people will treat me when they know I'm successful, I replied. So we both have work to do, David observed. We both have work to do, I agreed. As lunch continued, our conversation shifted toward the practical implications of my public emergence as Grace Memorial's director. David asked intelligent questions about my consulting practice, the structure of my charitable giving, and my plans for managing the increased attention that would accompany future funding decisions. For the first time in our adult relationship, David was treating me as an equal rather than a younger sister who needed guidance and protection. He asked for my opinions about healthcare policy, sought my insights into philanthropic strategy, and acknowledged the expertise I'd developed through years of work he'd previously dismissed as irrelevant. I have a confession, David said as we were finishing dessert. Sunday morning, after I got home from the gala, I spent 3 hours researching Grace Memorial's funding history. And I was stunned by the scope and sophistication of what you've built, the research protocols you've funded, the treatment centers you've supported, the advocacy programs you've developed. Sarah, you've literally changed how pediatric cancer gets treated across the Midwest. That was always the goal, I said simply. But the scale of it, The complexity of coordinating funding across multiple institutions, the integration of research and patient support services. This isn't just charitable giving. This is systems-level healthcare reform funded and directed by someone working outside traditional institutional structures. David's recognition meant more to me than I'd expected it to. For 8 years, I'd been building something extraordinary while pretending it didn't exist, at least in conversations with my family. Having someone I respected acknowledge the magnitude of what I'd accomplished felt like validation I hadn't realized I needed. I've been thinking about Emma a lot since Saturday night, David continued. About how young she was, how scared our parents were, how completely unprepared our family was for everything that followed her diagnosis. I nodded, remembering those 18 months as a period when our family had been forced to learn a new language of medical terminology, insurance procedures, and treatment protocols while trying to maintain hope in the face of increasingly grim prognoses. "I never thanked you for what you did during her treatment," David said quietly. "You became the family expert on her condition, the person who understood her medications and communicated with her doctors and navigated the insurance bureaucracy. You were 22 years old, and you took responsibility for things that our parents couldn't handle." The acknowledgement was unexpected and deeply moving. For 8 years, David had never mentioned the role I'd played during Emma's illness, and I'd assumed he either hadn't noticed or didn't consider it significant. "I did what needed to be done," I said. "You did what no one else in the family was capable of doing," David corrected. "And you did it while watching your baby sister die slowly, and your parents fall apart under the pressure." We sat in silence for several minutes, both lost in memories of a time that had reshaped our family permanently. "Grace Memorial is your way of making sure other families don't go through what we went through," David said finally. "Grace Memorial is my way of turning Emma's death into something that saves other children's lives," I replied. "It's my way of making sure her 18-month fight against leukemia contributes to better outcomes for kids facing the same diagnosis." "That's beautiful," David said simply. As we prepared to leave the restaurant, David asked one final question. That surprised me with its directness. "Do you forgive me? For 8 years of treating you like you didn't matter, for dismissing your work, for assuming you were unsuccessful rather than asking what kind of success you were building?" The question required me to examine feelings I'd been avoiding since Saturday night. "I forgive you for not understanding work that didn't fit your definition of achievement," I said. "But I need you to understand that forgiveness doesn't erase the impact of spending 8 years feeling invisible and dismissed by someone whose respect I wanted." David nodded solemnly. "I understand. And I want to earn back the respect I lost through my assumptions and dismissiveness." "Then show me that you can value work based on its impact rather than its visibility," I replied. "Show me that you can respect achievements that don't come with corner offices and public recognition." "I'll do that," David promised. As I walked back to my apartment that afternoon, I reflected on how profoundly my life had changed in the span of 5 days. Saturday night, I'd been someone whose success was known only to the families I'd helped and the institutions I'd funded. Today, I was someone whose story was being discussed in newspaper editorials and medical journal articles about innovative approaches to philanthropic giving. The change felt both liberating and terrifying. Liberation came from no longer needing to hide achievements I was proud of, or pretend that work I found deeply meaningful was just casual volunteering. Terror came from losing the protective anonymity that had allowed me to focus exclusively on results rather than managing public perception. But as I considered the conversation with David, I realized that Saturday night had given me something I'd been missing for 8 years: the opportunity to be known completely by people whose opinions mattered to me. For the first time since Emma's death, my family understood not just what I did, but why I did it and how successfully I'd been doing it. That evening, I called my mother to accept her invitation to Sunday dinner, the first family gathering I'd attended voluntarily, rather than out of obligation in more than 3 years. I was ready to be present as myself rather than as the character. I'd been playing to protect my real work. I was ready to be seen clearly, completely, and without apology for choices that had saved children's lives and strengthened families facing the worst experience anyone could imagine. Emma would have been proud of that decision, just as she would have been proud of everything Grace Memorial had accomplished in her memory. Up next, you've got 2 more standout stories right on your screen. If this one hit the mark, you won't want to pass these up. Just click and check them out.